not real.
Do you like scary movies?
I'm not afraid anymore!
You know what fear stands for? What? False evidence appearing real.
No. Be afraid. Be very afraid.
There's nothing to fear except God. Whatever that means to you.
Do I look like someone who cares what God thinks?
You're listening to The Fear of God, a podcast exploring the intersection between Christianity and the horror genre. Hello, and welcome to The Fear of God, Episode 1. I want to thank you for listening. My name is Lackey.
And this is Nathan Rouse.
And this is, again, the first episode of our show. Some of you, if you've come to us as a function of More Than One Lesson, you may know my voice as one of the co-hosts there. And that is actually kind of our parental, if we can call it that, podcast. We are under the More Than One Lesson banner, and that's where you can reach us to comment on this post or to find out more about us on morethanonelesson.com. It was interesting because I've been a co-host for More Than One Lesson now for probably about a year, and have been a guest on it a few times before that. But it wasn't that long ago that I kind of had this idea for another show, and that basically was an idea of exploring two things that don't always seem to have much relationship with each other, but two things that I'm very passionate about and love a great deal, and that is the horror genre, scary movies, scary stories, scary books, as well as Christianity.
I don't know, man. I think those feel like natural bedfellows, you know? Two great tastes that taste great together, if you will.
Exactly. Well, and I'm sure we're probably going to be talking about that too, because a friend of mine said, when I told him about the idea of this podcast, I said, "What do you think?" And he said, "I think you're setting yourself up to get punched in the face by the internet, but we'll see how it goes." So yeah, I mean, the whole idea was sort of born from, I've loved, for as long as I can remember, I have loved scary stories. I can remember watching Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho when I was 6 years old. I know. So
really, could we describe this podcast as broadcast therapy for you, Reed? And I'm just here to listen with all the other people, with all the other people.
Exactly. That's actually a good point. So why are you here, Nathan? I mean, obviously, this is something that I'm.
Do you mean that from an existential standpoint, or just from a real practical? Right now,
take it however you want it.
I know what you're asking. Although maybe the why are you here existentially, we'll get to that at some point in the podcast series. Well, yeah, you know, as you know, Reed, you and I have been friends for quite some time, close to 2 decades now at this point, and have always observed your deep affection for the horror genre as your friend, and sort of, I enjoy it. I have an affection for it. Yours definitely is a deeper well than mine. But as you talked about this project, you know, a couple of things sort of presented themselves. One was just what a fascinating intersection. This idea of faith and the horror genre and the ways in which those two things intersect. And, you know, another reason I'm here, I think, is to take those internet punches with you, you know. So bear that brunt a little bit. But also, I think there's something interesting about the dialogue versus kind of the monologue idea. You know, as you and I were talking about this several weeks ago even, I made the reference to like Conan O'Brien, or you can, you know, take your pick, or David Letterman or something. But in the Conan example, I used the phrase "the scared Andy." You know, that if you're Conan, I'm happy to be Andy, and in our paradigm that we're working from here, kind of the scared Andy. You know, I'm the one who, you as expert on the horror genre, and speaking from that position, I as observer who doesn't go see or watch absolutely everything that fits into that genre, but have always been pretty open to it. And just being able to participate and be able to sort of be that sort of everyman as we sort of endeavor to tackle this subject together. So that's sort of what I saw my role as, as we sort of interact over this subject matter.
Yeah, I think, and I can also speak to the Scared Andy thing that I have been in the movie theater with you. I think specifically a couple of movies come to mind. We saw The Ring together.
I am not a fan of The Ring, but that's a whole other movie.
No, you didn't like it.
That's a whole other podcast. No, and not because it's horror. I wouldn't be here if it was just because it was a horror movie. But regardless,
sure.
Was there another one you were going to say?
There were two more, actually. I remember specifically we watched The Others together.
Oh, yep.
Yeah, no, The Others is a film kind of the reverse of The Ring. I kind of liked The Ring. You didn't care for it. You really liked The Others. I didn't care for it.
Okay. And that's what we're here to talk about.
Exactly. But the one that we both enjoyed a great deal, and I can remember you almost crawled under your chair probably 4 or 5 times through the course of the movie, was The Exorcism of Emily Rose.
I do love old Emily Rose.
Now, would you say, because not being, as affectionate toward the genre as I am, and when I say that I'm affectionate towards the genre, according to my Netflix and Letterboxd lists, I have seen somewhere in the neighborhood of 950 scary movies in my lifetime, and that may not seem like that many to the avid movie fan, but well over 300 of them I have loved. So that is quite a sizable pool to sort of dip from. But would you say that there's any, do you have any favorites among the genre? There's anything that stands out to you?
Yeah. I mean, and I'm sure we'll get to some of the sort of theory behind some of this too. But yeah, I mean, I've got, entries into the genre that I'm rather affectionate towards. I think for me personally, as I've engaged the genre over the years, I would tend more to appreciate kind of the supernatural / thriller, sub-genre, if we will. Some of the more ghastly, slasher type stuff. I mean, again, depending on what it is, I'm not as huge a fan of. But hey, I'm here, and I'm going to buckle up for this bumpy ride of a roller coaster of engaging these horror movies right alongside you and or our listening audience out there.
Yeah, I didn't have the pleasure of seeing your face when I heard you glance over the list of the films that I kind of wanted to talk about, and there was a long list, but the films I wanted to talk about, and I heard you on the other end going, this is going to be some really scary stuff. And I didn't get the chance to see your face, but I could certainly imagine it. Yeah, and if I were to pick favorite scary movies myself, because I do tend to like pretty much all subgenres. There's very little in the horror genre that I'm not interested in and that I'm not in some way drawn to, but my favorites always come down to 3 main ones that sort of duke it out. I, of course, love John Carpenter's original Halloween. I'm sure we'll be talking about that very early. And then I also enjoy Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, which, as I said, I saw when I was very, very young and have loved it ever since. But the favorite, the king of all, it's my favorite, not only my favorite scary movie, but my favorite movie ever.
Pee-wee's Big Adventure.
Well, yes, actually. Have you seen Large Marge? She is
that is
terrifying.
She is quite scary. But it was the worst accident she'd ever seen. So, I mean,
oh man, we're gonna just leave that there because that's too frightening even for me. But no, my favorite movie of all time is The Exorcist.
Yep.
From 1974. It's a great film. It's a masterpiece and continually winds up at the top of most cumulative scary movie best all time, scariest of all time lists, and I think for good reason.
I'll throw in there too. I mean, I have seen The Exorcist. I watched that actually in college where you and I went together at old GWU. And, that was a long time ago at this point, but I remember it not being overpoweringly scary to me. I think I'd need to revisit it to really, as you grow and mature and get older and your eye for film or story appreciation kind of gets more fine-tuned. I feel like at that point in time, it was just kind of to check it off the list, oh, I got you. You gotta watch The Exorcist because that's sort of what you do. So I did, but I don't remember having much of a discernment about my ability to appreciate it.
I gotcha. Well, it's definitely, I'm always on board for anybody saying that they want to revisit The Exorcist, really, at any time.
Now hear me. I don't know that I use the phrase "I want to revisit The Exorcist." I am, I am open to, and for the sake of my Scared Andy role, willing to put myself through some of this in order to engage it on the level at which we're trying to do so. And I think, you know, to backpedal a little bit to the question you asked, you know, I don't know. See, I'm kind of going to shotgun some of these. You know, I don't know that any AFI sort of critic would put the films I'm going to say at the top of any list, but stuff I like, really like, you know, kind of the early Del Toro stuff. You know, thinking specifically of Pan's Labyrinth. And though he didn't direct it, loved The Orphanage.
Oh, yeah.
And see, you know, sort of echoing what I was saying earlier in terms of the sort of supernatural bent. I did like the others a lot. This seems like a cop-out, but a super recent one that, you know, it'll be probably some time before we get to in terms of talking, but just was very affecting was The Witch. You know, gave a lot of food for thought. Very powerfully made movie, though definitely earns its credentials. But, you know, I just generally have an affection for some of those more artsy-fartsy ones, if you will.
Sure, I understand that. Well, and some of the ones you mentioned, I mean, I don't know how many horror films would wind up on an AFI list to begin with, but some of the ones you mentioned are definitely among some highly critically praised. Guillermo del Toro is definitely very well favored in the horror world, even though he's made a couple of missteps here and there, but he's definitely very valued in that genre.
This is a random question, but it might be fun for us to entertain for a moment as I'm thinking through horror movies that really stuck out to me. I remember in college watching Halloween for the first time and being really impressed with it. You know, I don't know if you have this experience much where kind of a classic movie that you haven't seen that everyone considers a classic or best ofs or whatever that, you know, you're going to watch because, well, you got to watch it. As a reference, The Exorcist a minute ago might have fit that category. But for me, Halloween was one of those that I hadn't seen it, you know, was sort of like, okay, well, let's give this a go. And was just really taken with it. Kind of does exactly what history has been told to us that it does. Produced the right response, was very engaging, you know, wasn't just on the bucket list because it's on the bucket list. It really was affecting. Where I was going with that is a fun game to play at some point, maybe, you know, comparing horror icons. Like, are you a Michael Myers or a Freddy Krueger sort of fan?
Ooh.
You know, that's a bit of a rabbit trail that maybe we'll come back to at some point, though.
Yeah, I'm gonna jot this down because that sounds like a very fun game to play. I think that, and it's funny too because I would take the time to play it now, but there's something else that I really was kind of itching to sort of talk about, and that's the other half, if you will, or the yin to the yang of the horror films in this podcast and the horror literature, the horror genre as a whole, and that's also that you and I are both Christians. Now, I say that I would definitely call myself a Christian, and I'm not intending to.
Wow, are you trying to take something very meaningful away from me right now?
Well, here's what's funny, because here's why I say that. I know that sometimes, and I don't know if you experience this, but sometimes the moment that I say, okay, I'm a Christian, then there's people in the room who, unless they would also consider themselves Christians, or even if they do consider themselves that would automatically assume they know how I feel about every major political, social, and creative issue there is in the world. Sure. So it's funny, like I know some people who are, you know, very devout believers in Jesus Christ, but they shy away, oddly enough, from the term Christian for specific reasons. And it was funny because, yeah, I mean, you and I both are very devout in our faith, but I know for myself, I grew up in church. My grandfather was a pastor, my father was a pastor, my mom worked as the administrative bishop for the denomination where my family and I attended. So all of my life, I grew up in Southern fundamentalist Pentecostal church culture.
Which is sort of a horror movie unto itself.
Well, that's a very good point because I mean, I didn't have any sort of knowledge of this as I was growing up, but I would definitely venture to say, as maybe some of our listeners would, that some of the biggest sort of perpetuators of fear and dread and anxiety in culture today would be fundamentalist evangelical Christians.
Sure.
Now, do you agree with that statement?
Is that a trick question? I'm just kidding. Well, and sort of to fill in the gap a little bit, for myself as well. I don't share your same church upbringing experience, but did get involved, heavily involved in church as a teenager, and have had a roller coaster relationship with the church ever since then. Definitely, you're catching me at an interesting time in life where the word Christian is fraught with a lot more meaning than I wish it were. Definitely would consider myself have a deep love of Jesus and believe him to be the hope of and actively working to redeem all of creation and all of that sort of stuff, and believe very firmly in that. Sort of like you said a minute ago, not sure that I would line up lockstep, and in fact know that I would not line up lockstep with a lot of what would be considered mainstream American Christianity of today. But in terms of the question of the church's relationship, or as you sort of pinpointed, fomenters of fear, if you will. I like that phrase.
Yeah.
I think there's some definite truth to that. I mean, this just popped into my head. This was not intentional. This was not written down at all. But what immediately came to my mind just now was Carrie, the book and or movie, depending on what you've read or seen. And hear me, an avid Christian might hear that and think, well, that's Stephen King. And I'd say, well, yeah, but, it's a novelist, a storyteller is using a story to reflect a certain type of truth. I think, he was interested in examining exactly what you're describing, which is what is a potential outcome of extreme religious fundamentalism, in this particular case of a Christian variety.
Yeah.
So yes, I do think there is some truth to the notion that a religious entrenchment can definitely foster a fearful life.
Sure. Well, and I'll say too, like two things that makes me think of. Well, three. I'll piggyback on what you said about Carrie and acknowledge that you and I are both very avid Stephen King fans, and I've read every major published work except for the most recent one or two. But he frequently has characters of faith at varying degrees of likability and varying degrees of actually being able to live out something that we would consider to be admirable. But he's often got this notion of faith in general playing around in some of his stories, in sometimes ugly and in sometimes quite beautiful ways. Some of our listeners who may not know his works, clearly there are works like Carrie, like we just mentioned, and one of his more recent ones, Revival, that very much have critiques and negative reflections of faith. But then there are also in his canon books like Desperation and The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon, which have very hopeful and very meaningful expressions of faith in them. So his work definitely contains a lot of that.
Well, that leads me. I mean, Reed, I feel like to sort of add to the stew here. I know personally, I have a couple kind of anecdotes, but I'm interested and think, as we are talking about this genre, you did mention the roots in which your life found itself and how the chronology that led you or that exposed you to the horror genre or scary material or whatever. But are there any particular I think you were referencing what did you say you saw at 6 years old or 7, whatever?
Psycho.
Way too early age it was. Well, Psycho's not too bad.
Well, I also saw Wes Craven's A Nightmare on Elm Street when I was 8. So I mean, Psycho was just the earliest example.
That's probably wasn't healthy, but well, for my purposes, if I can throw these fun little anecdotes in here, as I've sort of reflected in preparing for talking about this with you and meditating on this whole concept, some fun examples of my exposure to the horror genre. We've already referenced Uncle Stevie, aka Stephen King, already, and we'll probably oft reference him in probably every podcast. But so sixth grade, how old are you when you're in sixth grade? 10?
You're typically about 9 or 10, maybe. Might even be 11.
I picked up, I don't remember how or why or what prompted it, but picked up Pet Sematary at 10. And
wow.
And I read it. I did read it. Mm-hmm. But it scared the you-know-what out of me. Enough, honestly, to kind of turn me off, as much as my 10-year-old mind could actively do this, turn me off from Stephen King for 10 years, 12 years.
Oh, wow. That is a long time.
Well, hear me. I'll throw in the mix here that gap was infiltrated by Stephen King Light. Old cousin Dean Koontz.
Yeah.
I don't know how old Dean is received in the marketplace, but
pretty favorably.
Yeah, I enjoyed his material during that time. And another little fun story is I remember distinctly. So I was the night owl in my home growing up, and normally could be found late in the night reading a book of some sort, some sort of novel or whatever. And specifically remember reading the book Winter Moon by him, which I don't.
Yeah.
Have you read Koontz stuff?
I've read plenty of Koontz books. I have not read Winter Moon. My favorites among his are, of course, Watchers, and I really liked Intensity a lot.
Well, I'm gonna call you out there. It's actually Watcher, I believe. We're gonna have to fact check that. It's not plural, but regardless, someone
you can fact check.
We're gonna Google that one after we're done here. However, so reading the book Winter Moon, and let's say it's midnight. This is, I don't know, freshman, sophomore year of high school. And I'm sitting on my bed, the lights are on, the rest of the house is asleep, and I'm at this really freaky part in it. And I could go into detail because I actually remember what the part is. I won't, it doesn't matter. What does matter is I needed to brush my teeth to get ready for bed. Either that or take contacts out or something. I needed the bathroom before going to sleep. And I was in bed reading it, and it reached the point of the night where I needed to be done. I got to go to sleep, got school in the morning. So I put the book aside, but I didn't want to get out of the bed because as they do, something might grab me from under the bed. I actively remember having this moment where it's like, I know rationally that there's nothing under my bed, but this book has scared the junk out of me, and I don't want to get out of bed because something may grab me. So, it would be a fun ending if I just sort of fell asleep and never brushed my teeth or something, but I think I actually ultimately overcame that fear. But I also have another fun story where I must have just watched a scary movie and was same house, 2-story house, last one to bed, as always. There's a bit of routine here. And the stairs to the second floor had a doorway to another room right next to them. And I remember distinctly, and again, rationale does not work when you're kind of in adrenalized mode from seeing or watching something. And I remember distinctly looking around the corner to make sure nothing was there and then running up the stairs. So yeah, those are that's my therapy time. Can you, as you recall, you're the well is deep, you recounted 900 movies, 300 something. I don't know. You threw out some very specific numbers earlier, but
oh yeah.
Do you have any stories like that or are you just that thick-skinned when it comes to this material that it doesn't freak you out?
No. Scaring me in a movie is kind of like striking out the pitcher. I'm really easy to scare.
Hey, you didn't say there were going to be sports references. I'm not ready for that.
That's your real fear. I will say that as a child, I was probably either 4 or 5 years old, and I do not remember this story, but my mom Da would tell this story so frequently that I know the story by heart.
And you said 4 or 5?
I was 4 or 5 years
Okay,
old,
okay.
and I would come out of the bedroom one day, and I said, "There's a monster in my closet," and so my mom and dad would say, well, no, there's no monster in your closet. You need to go back into your room and play. And I would come out a couple minutes later and I said, no, I'm telling you, there's a monster in my closet. And then, my ma and da said, okay, listen, there's no monster in your closet. There can't be a monster in your closet because Jesus lives here, and Jesus won't let there be any monster in your closet. And then I started to walk away, started to go back into my room, and then as I walk in, as the story goes, I turned around and I said, well, if that's true, then Jesus just said, grrr. I know, it's kind of a cheesy story, but it's totally true. You could call my parents right now and they'd tell you, they would recount the same exact story.
They would validate that Jesus growled at you.
Yeah, they absolutely would.
And we wonder why you watched, Psycho at 7. Because Jesus growled at you.
6, actually. 6.
Let's get it right.
Get it right. Well, I want to kind of bring us back around to talking about the other components, sort of the Christianity of things. The other thing that it made me think of back when we were talking about Stephen King, the other thing it made me think of is 2 things came to mind. First of all, there's a couple of phrases that we use in, I know that we used it in Southern charismatic cultures. I don't know if that transmitted to other cultures in more liturgical branches of faith, but I know they would talk about fire and brimstone preaching, where people would basically be saying over and over again things about that would make people think they were going to go to hell. That kind of language, those kinds of sentiments. And the other thing that the people would say is, and this is actually part of where the name of the show came from, people would say we're going to put the fear of God into somebody, which basically meant that we're going to scare them out of their current behavior into more acceptable, more aligned behavior. And I know there was a sermon that was by Jonathan Edwards, and it was called, and we actually studied this in literature classes in grade school, it's called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And the story goes that...
Such a lovely piece of work.
Well, the story goes that while he was preaching that in churches, evidently with a rather monotone voice, people would be screaming. People would be crying out because of what he was articulating. And it's been too long since I've read it for me to know the specific tones of content, but that's something that's always stood out to me as something that is reflective of areas where the Christian faith seems to intersect with the horror genre, but that's not specifically what we're going to be talking about on this show. One of the things that I wanted to sort of ask and explore for just a moment is why do you think that in present times Christianity and the horror genre are so at odds? Why do you think they don't tend to get along? I mean, I have my own theories, but do you think you know why Christians feel like if you were to Google right now Christian and horror films, your top 10 entries would probably be asking the same question. It'd be articles titled, "Should Christians watch horror films?" And a good 60% of those articles are going to conclude, no, they shouldn't.
Right.
So why do you think there's such a tenuous relationship there?
This is an indirect way of answering that, but I'm going to start attempting to and lead to where my thought was, and that's, I think I was going to say for better or worse, but I would definitely err on for worse. Historically, whether you're talking about horror as a movie genre, which is a relatively modern convention, or a darker side of what we would call entertainment or whatever, however you phrase that. I mean, I think that as we've glanced off of once or twice already, I think there's a lot of fear in the church. You know, you've on the one hand, you have this, what we could call institutionalized version of things, which would say the life of a person involved in the church has to look a very specific way based on the leader of whether it's that specific church or a denomination or a larger organization, you know, based on their interpretation of things. Thus, if you're out of line, you're out of the will of God, you know, what have you. I just think that there is a lot of fear embedded top down, you know, in the church. And part of that is, well, things that have the appearance, you know, the appearance of evil is also another favorite phrase of the churches sometimes, like, you know, don't drink, don't smoke, what do you do? But, you know, there's a list of things you shouldn't do and can't do to be called or to be considered right in the eyes of your church, your denomination, what have you. And so I think more often than not, that fear just sort of takes hold inside of us, like, well, if I've done this thing, I will not be considered right, either A, with the people that I'm associating with, or with God himself. And the last thing a person in that culture wants is to be considered not right with God, right?
Right. Oh, no, absolutely.
And so I think, now don't get me wrong. I do think there is, like for me personally, horror material that's very nihilistic. I don't love that stuff, but I can, as a mature person of faith, engage the material and sort of call it what it is. And so I think the thought I had as I was trying to answer your question, well, I don't want to get ahead of myself, because I was going to suggest what actually engaging the horror genre has the capacity to do, but that may be getting ahead of where you're wanting to go in the conversation.
Well, I'll say this, that we'll kind of want to try to sort of wind down over the course of the next 5 or 10 minutes here, and that's definitely something that I'd like to sort of land on. What you were just talking about made me think of something that I did intend to talk about. There are the two sort of anchor verses, Bible verses that when I was thinking about this particular podcast, what would sort of inform the kinds of things that we would think about. And the first one is Proverbs chapter 9, verse 10. It's a very often quoted passage of scripture that says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding." So that, of course, implies that, it's often where we get the phrase "the fear of God" from. That the fear of the Lord is supposed to be the beginning of wisdom, implying that it is a good thing. But then when you look in the New Testament, in 1 John chapter 4, verse 18, it says, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. And the one who fears is not made perfect in love." Now, in a moment, I'm going to ask you what you think about these two scriptures, but for me personally, I see them more as in dialogue with one another than I do as contradicting one another, because I do feel like there can be a sort of reverence and a sort of awe that can very much look like fear, something that says, we don't disrespect God, we don't take God lightly, if you will, that understanding forces beyond our control and even beyond our understanding might be the very beginning of coming to a wise understanding of the world around us and the things that we can control and the things that we can understand. But then when you look at the fact that the fear of God is not the stopping place, it's the starting place. And something that I had thought about when I was thinking about wanting to put this podcast together is, and it's probably a tagline that we're going to say every episode on the show, that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, but it's not the end of the conversation. That there are things to be explored beyond this notion of terror, beyond this notion of fear. And I actually think that by exploring things within art, within artistic expression, that you can come to learn how to better overcome the fears of real life and come to better learn how to overcome the things which terrify you in your day-to-day existence. One final thought before I throw it back to you is that I believe very firmly that there are really only two ways for the heart to experience and begin to become accustomed to dealing with fear. One, God forbid, is to actually experience scary things, to actually experience trauma, to actually experience loss, to actually experience pain. Those are the things that can teach your heart how to do it. But I think the other way, which I believe to be at least comparably effective, is to examine them through art, to see what artistic forms make you think about those things in your life. And I know some people would watch a scary movie and all they do is get filled with anxiety. All they do is get filled with terror. And so that's not pleasant for them, so they don't like doing that.
Sure.
And certainly it's not something that I would say. I'm a big proponent, as much as I talk about scary movies with my friends, and as much as people know that I'm a fan of it, I am always one of the first to say, if it upsets your sensibilities and if it is something that you can't tolerate as a person, then don't put yourself through torment for things that are not going to be enriching, and it's things that are not going to be helpful for you. But if you're somebody who is sort of drawn to the genre, and you're trying to understand why, and you're trying to understand what value it can have, especially among a slew of conversations of people saying that you can't be a person of faith and enjoy the horror genre, I disagree with that, and I think there's actually a great amount of potential value that the horror genre could provide.
Well, you should start a podcast to talk about it.
Exactly, I should. I'll keep that in mind. I'll ask a two-part question before we sort of wrap up. What do those scriptures make you think, and what value do you think that the horror genre could hold for somebody who is a person of faith that typically is supposed to think about things that are pure and good and right and true and all of that? What value does it hold?
Sure. And your fear of God, beginning of wisdom reference there, I'm no biblical scholar, or rather I would be sort of a lay person as far as that goes. And I wonder about what the actual word that we've interpreted or translated as fear there really is. Like our sort of understanding of fear, meaning a thing of which to be afraid. Again, this is just receive this as from Nathan and not from the Lord. But I think it's possible that verse specifically is not referring to you should be afraid of God, but more you use these words, awe and reverence, that in a Job-esque way, like the only thing, the only thing worth your awe and reverence in all of the fabric of creation is the creator, So I think that's an interesting and a more helpful approach to that verse, that if my viewpoint is the only thing really worth quote unquote fearing, or the only thing I should hold in complete and absolute awe and reverence is God, then that's a position that I can work from, as opposed to, this sort of, as we're talking about movies, this sort of Wizard of Oz sort of thing, this massive thing that you tremble before and so on and so forth. But so that's a thought there. I do think another, I don't know where I would reference specific verse-wise, but I do feel like there's a common refrain in, especially the New Testament, of not being afraid. I think what has been interesting to me as I've reflected on my engagement with the horror genre, and you can sort of take that idea and expand it out, whether it's roller coasters or something that causes, so there's this visceral level, right? There's a visceral sort of thrill, kind of like the experience of sitting and watching a scary movie, like disregarding the sort of metaphysical, possible spiritual conversation to be had there. There's just something fun, and so I think there's something to be acknowledged there. Do I love being scared to death? Of course not. Nobody loves that. But I do enjoy that experience of kind of jumping out of my seat at a scary moment in a movie. At the same time, on that spiritual level, and again, as you alluded to, my wife would fit this mold. There are people for whom they just can't engage that material because of the amount of anxiety it would cause. And we are not suggesting as actual therapy listeners go and subject themselves to The Witch or, The Exorcist or Seven or whatever. There are, you need to know your own boundaries. But as a person of faith who can engage that material, I also think of the Chesterton quote of, fairy tales, or in this case, horror. Finish it for me, because I know you want.
Oh, yeah, no. The Chesterton quote said that fairy tales are not valuable to us, and this is a paraphrase because I can't quote it verbatim. But fairy tales don't tell us that dragons exist; they tell us that dragons can be beaten.
Yeah, and I wanted you to have the fun of saying the quote because I know you love it, and I think for me that's part of what we're talking about. For me personally, is there's something about being able to watch a scary movie or engage, quote unquote scary material that on a visceral level creates kind of a thrill and just kind of the fun element, but also defangs it, robs it of the power that we sometimes want to attach to it that really isn't there.
Yeah.
Kind of that. I mean, exactly what you just said in terms of the dragon analogy. It's like the zombie. You can fill in the blank with whatever: the zombie, the vampire, the monster, the undead. Whatever you want to call it. I would say a great story. Because there's plenty of movies, there's plenty of books of varying degrees of quality, but the best are the ones that say not just that these things exist, but that you can triumph over them.
Absolutely.
And to me, there's something really powerful about that, and why, as opposed to just something more traditional like a drama or whatever, why I kind of keep coming back to this genre. Again, you would definitely trump me in terms of volume and quantity of consumption, but, what keeps Scared Andy sitting on the couch?
Well, yeah, I definitely think that there is a quality to horror films that lend themselves more easily to that kind of catharsis and that kind of purging of emotions that drama and especially comedy don't necessarily speak to. One thing that I had said recently coming out of The Conjuring 2 is, as I told a friend, I said, while I sit in a movie like that, something subconscious is listening to something subliminal. So something in the recesses of my mind is listening to something that the movie is saying on sort of a subtextual level. And I think part of that is that we don't have control of everything. We're not in control of nearly as much in our lives as we would like to be, and things get out of control in a horror film real fast. And I think, like exactly what you're saying, that once we are able to sort of see things get out of control, watch the dragons emerge, watch the dragons claim victims, but then watch, at least in most cases, somebody overcome that dragon, or if we have examples, and there are plenty of horror movies like this too, where they don't overcome the dragon, then that can also have something to teach us about our own lives and something to put things in perspective. I had said to someone else about the danger in horror films that they're cyclical. You almost never get rid of them. That's why we have so many sequels to so many horror films. It's like you can get rid of them for the moment, but they're going to come back. There is I think, a point to be made that we will have trouble in this world, that we will have things that are going to never quite be fully gone, but that we can defeat them, and that we can remember, as our faith teaches us, that sure, evil may claim many battles along the way, but that it will not win the war, and some would even say that it has already lost the war, something that I hold very true. I said in the passing of Wes Craven, I said the reason that I so admire and love horror filmmakers is that they make you so scared of the dark that you want to turn on a light. And I think that's part of what scary movies do for me, and I think part of what these kind of conversations can do for other people is, it's like when we're scared, it makes us want to turn on the light. It makes us want to think about how to overcome these things. And I think if we engage with it in an appropriate way, I mean, like just actually engage with what it's saying and what it's dealing with, then I think we might come away with something pretty substantial and pretty whole. And I think I kind of want to leave the conversation there. I think we've had a really good chat about this sort of thing. Is there anything else really burning in your mind that you want to add before we sign off?
No.
All right.
It actually isn't.
All right. Well,
you put a nice little bow on it.
Well, we really want to hear from you, as I had said earlier, and as I will probably tag the show with many times, is that the fear of God may be the beginning of wisdom, but it's not the end of the conversation. You can continue that conversation with us. You can like us on Facebook. We're also going to please visit morethanonelesson.com and not only see the Fear of God podcast posts, but also the More Than One Lesson podcast, and you can see a number of articles there. So visit us there. You can like us on Facebook, as I said. You can follow me on Twitter at Reed Lackey.
And I think you can find me on Twitter at the Nathan Rouse. THE
Perfect.
Nathan Rouse.
And then you can also email us at just fearofgodpodcast@gmail.com. Fearofgodpodcast@gmail.com, all one word. We would really love to hear from you, and I thank you very much, Nathan, for being a part of this conversation with me.
Yeah, looking forward to plenty more.
Yeah, and so next week, if all goes according to plan, we will be talking about a film that is not completely hated, but is also not completely loved. It's a film by a very divisive director by the name of M. Night Shyamalan, and he actually didn't direct the film, but he wrote it. And we're going to be looking at 2010's movie Devil. In terms
of pure titles, you're starting with a bang, aren't you?
Yeah. There was intention behind that.
The Fear of God, Episode 2, Devil.
So if you want to watch that movie and come back next week, and we will be discussing that film. Thank you again, Nathan, for being here, and
thank you, Reed.
And we will chat with you guys later. Okay, bye-bye.